green-white decks are very susceptible to Fire Fist Striker. So that's a pretty big weapon that
Sure.
you have, but overall this is not a matchup I would want to be playing if I was in Thomas's shoes.
Yeah, I mean, Thomas is playing a deck with like 30 creatures, and most of the ones in his opponent's deck are just going to be bigger than his, right?
Correct.
That's pretty tough.
It appears that Bryan has started with a mulligan to what appears to be 5 cards, which is obviously a big deal for Thomas. Thomas playing the red list, 74 of the 75 that I posted on Facebook and Kibler put on his article, so this is my last horse in the race, more or less.
Well, it appears to be working out so far. He's only a win out of a very likely top 8 berth. You will notice that Thomas has actually been paired down against Bryan. So we actually have 5 7-0 players currently, I think. So
Number 4. Bryan's on a 4-card hand, so this will be a struggle. But
Thomas starts strong.
The green-white deck does have some really, really powerful tools against mono red. I don't want to undersell this. He has a Polukranos, he has Voice of Resurgence, he has Root Bone Defenses, Advent of the Worm, Selesnya Charm, a ton of powerful cards. So even on a 4-card hand, Bryan has a ton of game if his hand's functional.
Yeah, here we see Bryan shock himself for Temple Garden, but then pass the turn, pretty much repping Selesnya Charm and nothing else here. The question is, will Thomas trade? Will he want to Lightning Strike the token? He has shocks in his deck. He can obviously get rid of it that way as well, depending on what he wants to do.
I would be, if I was in Thomas's position, I'd be pretty happy to just trade off as much as possible with my opponent on 4 cards.
After all, via the Temple Garden, your Cackler basically already got in 2 damage, right?
Yeah. So we'll see if, and there's a Rubble Belt Maka.
Okay.
We'll see if Thomas has any other follow-up. He does not.
It's an interesting trade.
Not a very powerful opening from Thomas here. I mean, Bryan's, he's going to be able to make his land drops as probably a pretty reasonable life total. Chandra's Phoenix enters the red zone.
Boon Satyr comes into block on the Rakdos Cackler. Bryan just trying to not take damage and stay alive here, which is going to be pretty awkward because as he draws out the game, his mulligan will only begin to hurt him more and more because Thomas just has more cards, right?
Yeah. So Bryan is out of cards. He plays a Loxodon Spider and a Guildgate. So what you see is what you get. But again, Polukranos, Advent of the Worm, there are some very powerful top decks that Bryan has in his deck.
Loxodon Spider specifically is one of the reasons I think I might have wanted to hold on to that Rubble Belt Mako for a later attack. Because I think trading with the Knight token, like you said, was probably fine for a Rakdos Cackler, but something like a Loxodon Spire can get in the way of several creatures in our deck, and Rubble Belt Maka is an excellent solution to that creature.
Yes. Thomas tapping 2 as a Fire Fist Striker. Fire Fist Striker plus Mutavault, for the record, the most powerful combination of cards afforded to us in Standard.
Mog Flunkies no longer qualify?
Yeah.
not the killer combo it once was. Bryan knows his Smiter's useless, so he goes on the offense with it.
And this is a spot where Bryan can very easily win the game if his draw step was Advent of the Worm. This is what I'm talking about. This green-white deck has a lot of tools against decks that are trying to brawl on the ground.
Yeah, Advent of the Worm would be able to eat a creature here and then continue to pressure Thomas's life total. It does not take many attacks from 5/5 and a 4/4 to end a game. Usually 2 does the trick, but the pain-free mono-red mana base actually gives it a little bit more legroom.
Sends in both. No blocks from Bryan. And Thomas has probably gotten himself out of the woods with that lack of an advent on that turn.
Emissary gives him a Goros Chainwalker, and now he just has this gigantic, fearsome army. It's going to be pretty tough for Bryan to come back.
Bryan draws.
Looks like he sandbagged a land on the previous turn, is my guess, and has now drawn some kind of 3-drop based on the way he's grouping his cards. Yep, Loxodon Smiter. Sandbagged a Guildgate. It's an awkward one to sandbag. He could have gotten punished if he drew a Scion of Vitu-Ghazi.
Yes, correct. A risky bluff there.
Yeah, and we see exactly what I described earlier. He's drawing this game out, but there are so many more cards on the mono-red side that the fact that he has continued to survive is actually not going to be enough to save his life total, as Thomas can just throw away cards at this point, getting in damage. A hallmark of the red strategy.
So like 9 damage is coming across here. Thomas has a shock in his hand and a Maka and 2 lightning strikes, it looks like. So
a bounty.
Yeah.
Lets the trade happen.
He's got a lot left in the chamber, and so he's going to take game 1. So we're going to go to the sideboard here where Bryan has access to even more powerful tools for this matchup. He has 2 copies of Centaur Healer, 3 copies of Unflinching Courage, a Tristani, and a Druid's Deliverance, and a Brave the Elements. All additional very powerful tools against a red deck that's primarily attacking on the ground.
Yeah, looking over at Thomas Pannell's sideboard, which I imagine you're a little familiar with.
This is 74 by 75. Yeah, he cut the hammer that I had in the sideboard for a Burning Earth, and otherwise it's the same list.
Well, that's not going to really matter in this matchup since I don't think you would bring in either card here. But he does have 4 Mizium Mortars, an excellent solution to those Loxodon Smiters that can otherwise gum up the ground in a pretty big way. He has a few other cards that might be interesting, though. You've got the more Rubble Belt Maka, if you want to be there. He has Active Treasons. Theoretically, I suppose you could board in something like Skullcrack if you were particularly concerned about something along the lines of Unflinching Courage, but I don't even know if I would like it that much in this matchup, since aren't you just planning on trying to like kill all their guys anyway?
Yeah, in my opinion, the best path of the red deck to take in this matchup is just to play to the board and be as disruptive as possible on Bryan's early game, trying to get tricky with Skullcracks and stuff like that and Active Treasons. It's really hard because the green-white deck is so good at blocking that the more that you gum up your hands with things that, you know, don't kill creatures or don't impact the board, the green-white deck is very good at winning that sort of game.
Yeah.
So I really like Mizium Mortars a lot. I really like bringing in the 3rd Rubble Belt Maka. I wouldn't really touch the rest of the sideboard. It is potentially a different conversation when Thomas is on the play and with more information, because some of these green-white decks can be sideboarded in such a way where Active Treason is good against them. If it looks like Bryan has a lot of Polucrinoses in his deck, for example, Active Treason becomes more attractive. But in the dark, because a lot of these green-white decks are more hubbed around token creatures, or creatures that can be played at instant speed, or just good defenders and not really aggressive threats, I wouldn't want to touch Active Treason.
I think that makes a lot of sense. After all, you know, a Lava Spike is only as good as the first 17 points of damage it dealt, and Skullcrack is, at the end of the day, just a tricky Lava Spike.
Yeah, but the 4 Mortars and the 3rd Rubble Belt Maka are all very good here.
I agree. Thomas's list, obviously, you know it pretty well, but it has a lot of these creatures that can grow a little on the front end. You've got the Fire Drinker Satyrs, improved Jackal Pup, and Foundry Street Denizen even, obviously, can create some really aggressive starts on the back of Burning Tree Emissary and Rubble Belt Maka. So he's got a really good shot at getting in under, especially if he can Mortars a Smiter like the second it comes down. Just get it out of the way, keep his opponent from blocking until about turn 4. And by then he might have, you know, as many as 4 creatures already in play. He can start losing them.
And Fire Fist Striker, again, is a very potent tool against green-white decks.
Sort of a Doomblade that attacks, really.
Yep. Thomas doesn't have access to Legion Loyalist, which was an important part of Block Constructed, of containing the green-white decks. So Selesnya Charm can be an answer to Fire Fist Striker, and Advent of the Worm can also be an answer, but if Bryan is all in on Smiters and Voices and Fleece Main Lions and those kind of creatures, a clock backed up by Fire Fist Striker and a couple of removal spells is a really good recipe for beating the Selesnya deck.
Yeah, if you can keep him to 1 creature in play for most of the game, you'll get in a ton of damage with these early drops and your 2 drops.
And again, the green-white deck is a little soft in the air, so Chandra's Phoenix is also a good tool.
One of my all-time favorite Magic cards.
It is powerful, but not in an invasive way, and the flavor is really sweet.
Yeah, yeah.
Chandra's Phoenix is a great design, and I'm pretty happy to see it reprinted. It was one of those things where it was originally printed, and the power level of the format was such that Chandra's Phoenix just didn't have much of a home. Like when Squadron Hawk is a thing that's going on, there's not a lot of room to be playing a 2/2
I was fearless with my Chandra's Phoenix. I kept the faith. I remember beating many a timely reinforcements.
But now, you know, with the power level of the format's a little bit lower, and you're seeing things like Ajani and Chandra's Phoenix play a role that was way more influential in the metagame than it was when they were originally printed.
Yeah, creature battles are definitely becoming more and more commonplace in Standard, figuring out ways to break through or ways to have the best threat. I mean, that's why Desecration Demon has taken off, right? It just comes down, usually stalls the board for that turn, gains you a lot of tempo, and then it's just this giant threat that can easily end the game in 2 or 3 swings.
Yeah, the games are very creature-oriented. I mean, I'm very happy with Rubble Belt Maka, and that is a situational giant growth, which is historically not knocked down a lot of doors in Constructed. So.
Yeah, even giant growth has been not gaining much respect in Constructed, but in this deck, especially with the weapons you're trying to actually fight with, you know, I like it a lot. Loxodon Smiter's that big creature that I just think Rubble Belt Maka is a really sweet solution to.
Yes. Smiter is a pain, and you can only play so many removal spells and keep the core of your deck intact.
Yeah.
So Bryan and Thomas both keep 7. Bryan starts with a Forest, draws Advent of the Worm, and there's a Fleecemane Lion, a card that got quite a bit of buzz when it was originally spoiled, but hasn't made a huge constructed splash yet.
Yeah, a strict upgrade to Watchwolf and doing a lot of work in a format where Colonian Tusker was pretty underplayed. It shows you how easy it is to have a two-color card versus a mono-color card in a lot of these two-color decks. Definitely a price, and the monstrosity is just huge.
Yep. So, Thomas, showing the gulf in creature quality between Selesnya and Mono Red, fires back with a 3/2 that cannot block.
I mean, at least he had a 3-power creature, right? It could have been worse.
It's true. And this is also sort of a weird part of the matchup from the red perspective is the Selesnya deck is actually capable of putting on quite a bit of pressure. You don't have all day with Advent and Populate and Spiders and Fleecemane Lions. The fact that a lot of your guys are unleashed is a bit of a drawback because there's a lot of spots where you want to be chump blocking and giving yourself another turn to draw a card or hit in the air with your Phoenixes. The green-white deck actually can clock you for what is basically a board presence deck. Certainly much more in a much more threatening way than something like Mono Blue Devotion can, for example.
Yeah, between Chainwalker and Cackler and the new Fire Drinker Satyr, you actually have a lot of creatures that cannot effectively block.
So you see a Burning Tree Emissary and a Lightning Strike to take out one of the Fleecemane Lions, and Thomas sort of regaining some of the initiative here.
Really kind of keeping parity. He did get an extra creature onto the board, but any creature from Bryan will trump one or both.
Yeah.
Will he pass turn? Oh, he shakes his head. Oh, I don't have anything. You're up, I guess.
The 4-mana sigh. I've seen that. I've seen that before.
We've seen it for years now. Previously, a role taken by Restoration Angel from Avacyn Restored. Now a role happily filled by Advent of the Worm.
The original pause and sigh was Second Thoughts. That was the first one.
Oh, Second Thoughts. That takes me way back.
But Restoration Angel certainly another good candidate.
Mm-hmm.
So Thomas trying to noodle through how he's going to deal with this, what he can presume to be an Advent of the Worm here.
He clearly expects Advent, and he doesn't have a lot of fantastic options, like whether he has anything or not. Oh, Bryan, look at Bryan moving that Forest over, trying to represent Boon Satyr instead of the Advent, perhaps. Just put a little seed in the mind.
I like that.
I like that.
I like that better than the shaking of the head.
Thomas decides to go for it. Bryan, what's he going to do? I imagine he's going to cast Advent of the Worm and block.
I think he might take this hit. He might be happy to race, and that looks like what he's doing here.
Interesting. It certainly is a race. It's always dangerous to get into these races with Mono Red, though, especially when they're the deck with the reach, right?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I can gather from Bryan being unwilling to trade 2-for-1 there is his hand's really light on action. He might have Advent and nothing, basically.
Maybe he's untapping into Rootborn defenses, and he just really wants to keep the 5/5 token around, because if he takes this 5, he can prevent basically the same amount of damage on the next turn.
Yep.
Ooh, Thomas might be 2-for-1ing himself anyway to prevent Rootborn defenses from happening, which this makes sense, right? If Bryan is refusing to block, it kind of would make you feel like there's a Rootborn defenses involved.
He also may want to use something like a Lightning Strike on the Fleecemane line to prevent it from going monstrous next turn. That's another possibility.
Definitely. Token is in play.
And
that's exactly what Thomas does, yeah.
So we're going to see if Bryan has any of his sideboarded cards here are also just devastating for Thomas, whether it's Centaur Healer or especially Unflinching Courage are both backbreaking.
Yeah, Unflinching Courage would be incredible. Druid's Deliverance would be massive.
Gross.
And we've already discussed the Rootborn defenses he has in the main deck. All of these cards would just be a complete blowout.
Just an Experiment 1 and an attack, knocking Thomas to 9.
Thomas is on the clock, but this is currently a race he can win just based on the board.
And the way that Thomas didn't attack with his Mutavault last turn, I suspect he may have Skullcrack in his hand. Because why wouldn't he ship the Mutavault in as well? It's because he wanted to be able to both Lightning Strike the Fleecemane Lion and use the remaining 2 mana for something. And so I think the answer might be Skullcrack.
Makes sense. He had a Shock, so perhaps that also explains it. He wanted to be able to go Strike Shock if there was an Advent before blockers.
Sure.
Both of those are very reasonable explanations, and the Shock clears the way on the Experiment 1. And Bryan did not have a Rootborn defenses there. It seems like it would have been a pretty good time to play it if he did.
Yes. That would be a good spot.
Good news for Thomas. That also eliminates some other things. Probably eliminates Selesnya Charm. I don't know. Maybe the 2-2 Knight's better than the 1-1 Experiment one there.
Here comes a Phoenix.
And Thomas sends in the team. Bryan has the Druid's Deliverance. Oh, dear Lord. That is gross.
I mean,
Thomas, yeah, we got the reads. Not unexpected. Druid's Deliverance, not what we would call a commonly played card in Constructed. It's not even really that commonly played in its limited format.
Now, in fairness, it's not that huge of a blowout because Thomas actually can't beat Populate from this spot, I don't think. As he's going to be getting hit for lethal this turn.
Yeah. He has the one block.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, no. he's
tokens
gone.
Trample, and that's exactly lethal.
I guess we have to make him assign damage. Is that?
So now, Thomas, having seen that Druid's Deliverance, even though there's only a one of, unless he's really familiar with Bryan's list, I very strongly suspect he's going to go back into his sideboard and grab his Skullcracks.
Yeah.
Skullcrack also is much better on the play because you're able to kind of like leverage your advantage a little bit better. But I think that he's going to go in and bring those Skullcracks in.
Yeah, it's definitely the sort of card that adjusts how you have to play in a big way once you see it, which is the main goal of running a one-of like that, for sure.
Yes. Huge upside, not something you want to draw a bunch of copies of because it's sort of predicated on other things going on, but as a one-of can be devastating, and it was exactly that right there.
Yes. One of the better Druid's Deliverance I've seen, and I've cast more than the average person, I think. It was one of my pet cards in RTR Limited. I loved the feeling every time.
So the problem is there's only so much you can de-emphasize the beatdowns, basically, if you're in Thomas's position. Based on the cards that he's seen so far out of Bryan's deck, I think it's reasonable to remove Shock from your list.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking too. You've seen basically Experiment 1 that it dies to, and everything else it's like okay to a 2-for-1 against.
Right.
Boon Satyr is really not that impressive to be killing since it won't actually be in 4-2 mode all that often, and when it is, they get to choose when you have the opportunity to shock it.
So if I was in Thomas's spot right now, I lean towards wanting to remove the one. Certainly, Foundry Street Denizen is at the top of the list because you're removing some number of creatures. Also, one-toughness is sort of a critical drawback against Selesnya because that means a one-toughness creature plus Maka still just trades. You don't get out in front. So your two toughness creatures are an important threshold for surviving the combat, keeping your creature in play.
Yeah.
I think that I would probably just remove the Shocks and the Foundry Street Denizens for the Maka Skullcracks and Mortars, and maybe cut one copy of either Fire Drinker Satyr or Chain Walker for the 9th card.
Okay. I think I like Fire Drinker Satyr there.
It's very good at trading up.
Yeah.
Is the thing about Satyr. It matches up well against some of the the Fleece Mane Lion type of threats.
It's also positioned well in these like slightly longer post-board games that you start playing with the deck, right?
Yes. You're going to see Thomas go back to the well here.
Yep. Bryan, he has it looks like a keepable 7. I think I also saw the one of Druid's Deliverance in his opener.
Yep. That one of Deliverance I think is very powerful here. Certainly Thomas has the ability to go and get his Skullcracks and alleviate it somewhat, but I don't know if Bryan is still contemplating a mulligan here or what. He's going to keep.
Yep. Pressure is on. For Bryan, keep in mind, this is an elimination match. If he loses this, he is out of top 8.
Yes.
Whereas Thomas can lose this one, and he still gets another chance to win and then either draw or win again. Bryan's back, however, against the wall.
Yep. And mulligans are really rough against a deck like Selesnya since they're so good at attritioning you out. There's some matchups where I don't mind mulliganing too much if they're all kind of all in on sweepers, but the Selesnya deck kind of just grinds you down, and all the individual cards that you lose are really meaningful.
Of the decks to mulligan with, aggressive red decks that have a lot of creatures are the ones that I don't mind as much, since those are the kind of games that mulligans are good at stealing anyway, right? Where you can just get in before the card advantage gets you in the later game.
Experiment 1 starts off the action from Bryan. It looks like Thomas has a Burning Tree Emissary and some stuff to do with it. I don't know, and a second mountain. So appears on the surface to be a pretty solid mulligan to 6.
Yeah. The something to do is a Gorehouse Chainwalker Unleashed. It's a reasonably aggressive start on 6, and Bryan with just his 1/1 He's going to have to do some work to match it. It looks like he has a Voice of Resurgence in his hand. I don't know if he has the mana to cast it just yet.
Yeah. Voices, with no Pillar of Flame, Voices become, and there's a trigger on the Experiment one, and these are the type of games where you're really on Fire Fist Striker or Chandra's Phoenix or Bust. Because the ground's quickly becoming a pretty untenable place to try to do any damage.
Bryan willing to attack. Kind of an interesting thing. Once I've seen Rubble Belt Maka, I might be a little more interested in holding both back, especially if I'm green-white. Aren't I just trying to get to the late game, really?
Yeah, I agree. You have an enormous amount of inevitability. I would just be inclined to batten down the hatches a little bit and wait.
If Thomas attacks this turn, he can use something like a Rubble Belt Maka to keep his creature alive against the Voice Resurgence, and the Voice token will be too small to trigger Experiment 1 again, which is not exactly where you want to be at. You'd ideally like to be generating a sweet creature off it.
And this is sort of what I was speaking to about the mulligans being especially bad against green-white. When you're playing against a deck that just has Supreme Verdict or just has Jace or whatever, you can kind of, the mulligan matters a lot less, but when they're just grinding you down like this, it all adds up. But Thomas has a Mutavault and a Fire Fist Striker, which are two pretty potent weapons to have against green-white tokens.
We see some of the difficulty in sequencing lands, even in a monocolor deck, manifest here with Thomas, right? He went turn 2 Burning Tree Emissary off of 2 mountains into the Chainwalker. If he had gone into the Striker, he'd have a weaker creature. He wouldn't have the Mutavault to attack with it anyway. And if he plays the Mutavault, he obviously can't even cast the Emissary in the first place. So kind of an interesting sequence.
Bryan just passes, representing potentially Selesnya Charm.
Yeah, it seems pretty likely he has Selesnya Charm here. Otherwise, sending everybody, I feel like I would still have held back 1 to just try and kill that Striker.
Right, I'm not a huge fan of the amount of racing. Although if he's just planning on using Selesnya Charm to kill the Fire Fist Striker, leaving 1 creature back on defense doesn't really do anything.
Yeah, maybe he's just gonna. Okay, he has the Charm. Maybe he was. I was considering the option of also potentially just Druid's Deliveranceing to gain like 9 life here. It's not an unreasonable proposition. 9 life's a lot.
And another Chainwalker.
Thomas keeping up the heat. I see a Tristani in Bryan's hand, another 1-of from his sideboard. He's also got an Advent, a Loxodon Smiter, just non-stop fat from the looks of things.
And I think I'm in Thomas' seat there that last turn. There's a pretty strong argument for not sending Fire Fist Striker. Bryan's attack is such a loud representation of having Selesnya Charm, and it's really rough to give up your Fire Fist Striker here.
I actually like that hold a lot. I didn't even think about it looking at the board, but that makes a lot of sense to me. It's clearly one of your more valuable creatures, especially with a Voice still on the board, no matter what you do.
Yeah.
I'd be curious how Bryan would react to that.
There's a Smiter and involves the Experiment 1.
Looks like Bryan lacks a 4th land. Just has a handful of spells, and now he is in fact going to move on to defense.
So Thomas's kind of path from here involves either Chandra's Phoenix or overloading Mizium Mortars. Those are the 2 ways he can kind of catch up a little bit.
He can potentially combo Striker with something like a Rubble Belt Maka to get in a bunch as well and hold on to some of his position. He still has a ton of guys in play, and Bryan is strapped on mana. If he runs out of spells on this turn, Thomas can start squeaking through. Ooh. 4th land is a backbreaker, puts in Tristani.
Ugh.
That evolves Experiment 1, and in conjunction with Voice of Resurgence, the Tristani could potentially trigger to gain some additional life.
And the green-white deck is just locking in the sleeper hold here.
Yeah.
He's not going to be attacking for a little bit, but Thomas is going to be drawing a lot of 2-1s and 3-2s, and Bryan's going to be gaining 5 life a turn and making a lot of free tokens. So.
Yep. This is exactly the kind of board state that Bryan really wants to move into. It just creates nothing but unfavorable situations for Thomas, and the Tristani is really just icing on the cake. He even has that Druid's Deliverance should anything go wrong. I think he has it all, as they say.
Yes.
Even in the overloaded Mizium Mortars at this point, it's not going to be that damaging.
And Bryan's ahead enough that he can start testing the waters with a couple attacks here and there and whittling down Thomas's life total. Thomas can't really block and win this game, so he's just going to take the hit from the Smiter and fall to 10. And it appears that Advent of the Worm is in Bryan's hand, which will effectively lock this game up.
Yeah, that is big bad news. Thomas has a board filled with unleashed creatures. They're not going to be able to defend him. Whether Bryan decides to go all out and send everyone next turn, or whether he decides to grind it out over 2 turns, it's going to be a lock either way.
So Experiment 1 gets triggered. Tristani gets triggered. And now all the Chain Walkers in the world won't save Thomas.
And the Singleton Banisher Priest comes down to complete the cycle, as it were. Or no, he does not cast the Banisher Priest, so he drew it. That's pretty much every one of in his deck. And all of them would be quite good.
Yep, and Thomas is going to let it go. So Thomas Pannell falls to 7-1, still in a position to win next round and potentially draw, or potentially have to rip off the 9-1. And Bryan